There are survival stories that make you afraid of nature. And then there are stories that make you afraid of what human beings are capable of doing when nature leaves them with no other choice. This is one of those stories. And I'll be honest with you, I've read a lot of survival stories. I've read about people surviving in deserts, freezing rivers, jungles, oceans, and mountains. But every time I come back to what happened in the Andes in 1972, I get the same uncomfortable feeling. Because I don't think most of us can honestly say what we would do. Not what we'd like to think we'd do, what we'd actually do. Imagine you're sitting inside an airplane with your friends. You're young, you're laughing, you're traveling to Chile to play rugby. You have no reason to think this day will be different from any other day of your life. And then, a few minutes later, you're falling toward a mountain. On October 13, 1972, a Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild FH-227D was flying towards Santiago, Chile. On board were 45 people, including members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, their friends and family. They were young. Some were students, some were athletes, some were parents. They were ordinary people going on a trip. And that's something I think is important to remember. When we look back at historical disasters, we tend to turn the people involved into characters. The survivors, the victims, the heroes. But at the beginning of this story, they were just people. People who had plans for the weekend. People who expected to go home. People who had no idea they were about to enter one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The airplane was approaching the Andes. The pilots believed they were in a different position than they actually were, and that mistake would become catastrophic. The aircraft began descending too early. The clouds and mountains hid the terrain, and suddenly the crew realized something was terribly wrong. The airplane wasn't where they thought it was. It was inside the Andes, and the mountains were directly ahead. There was almost no time. The aircraft struck a mountain ridge. The wings were torn away, the tail separated, and what remained of the fuselage slammed down the mountain and eventually came to rest in a remote, snowy valley. When I imagine that moment, I can't even process the speed at which their lives changed. 1 second you're sitting in an airplane. The next second, the airplane is gone. Your friends are injured. People are screaming. And outside the windows, there is nothing but snow and mountains. Dozens of people initially survived the crash, but surviving the impact was only the beginning. And this is where the story becomes difficult. Because the survivors were now sitting at roughly 12,000 feet above sea level. There were no buildings, no roads, no trees, no nearby villages, just enormous mountains covered in snow, and the temperature could drop dramatically at night. They had almost no proper winter equipment. They were a rugby team. They had clothes for traveling to a match, not for surviving an Andean winter. Think about that. If you or I were planning a survival expedition into the Andes, we'd probably think about thermal clothing, boots, food, navigation equipment, emergency communication. These people had none of that. They had an airplane that had just been destroyed, and that airplane was now their only shelter. The survivors immediately started doing what they could. They pulled injured people from the wreckage. They searched for food. They tried to make the fuselage livable. They used luggage, clothing, seat materials, anything they could find. The airplane itself became a kind of shelter, and for a moment, there was still hope. Because they had seen other aircraft searching for them. They thought rescue was coming. I mean, why wouldn't they? An airplane had crashed. People knew their flight was missing. Search planes were looking for them. Surely someone would find them. But the Andes had other plans. Search aircraft flew over the region, and somehow they didn't see them. That's one of the details of this story that I find almost cruel. Imagine standing outside your crashed airplane and seeing a plane in the sky. You wave, you scream, you jump. You believe your nightmare is finally ending. And then the aircraft disappears. Nothing happens. You're still there, still trapped, still freezing, still waiting. The white fuselage was almost impossible to distinguish from the snow below. The mountains swallowed them, and after several days, the search was eventually called off. The outside world began to assume that nobody had survived. But inside the wreckage, people were still alive. I honestly don't know what is worse, being told that nobody is coming, or not knowing whether anybody knows you're alive. Because once the search ended, the survivors faced a horrifying realization. They might have to save themselves. But how? They had almost no food. The mountains were enormous. They didn't know where Chile was. They didn't know where they were. They didn't have proper maps or mountain equipment, and many of them were injured. Yet they still had something, each other. And at first, that mattered enormously. They organized themselves. They shared food. They helped the injured. They tried to keep everyone warm. One of the survivors, Roberto Canessa, was only 19 years old and a medical student. He began helping treat the injured with the limited medical knowledge and supplies available. Others repaired the shelter. Others searched for food. Everyone had to contribute, because there was no rescue team anymore. There was only them. And then came the food problem. This is the part of the story that most people know, but I don't think people truly understand what it means. The airplane had some food: chocolate, wine, jam, small amounts of whatever passengers had brought with them, but it wasn't enough. There were dozens of people, and every day they were burning enormous amounts of energy simply trying to stay alive in the cold. So the food disappeared. First slowly, then quickly, and eventually there was nothing left. This is where the story crosses a line that is difficult even to talk about. The survivors realized that the bodies of people who had died were the only available source of food. There was no hunting, there were no plants, no animals wandering around the glacier, no supermarket waiting around the corner. There was only snow, stone, ice, and the bodies of their dead friends. I want to stop here for a second, because it is very easy to judge people from the comfort of a warm room. It's easy to say, I would never do that. Maybe you wouldn't. I hope you never have to find out. But I think it's unfair to judge what a starving human being does when death is standing directly in front of them. These people had conversations about it. They struggled with it. They had moral and religious objections. They didn't simply look at the bodies and say, "Great, problem solved." No, for them, it was horrifying. And yet they understood something even more horrifying. If they didn't eat, they might die too. Then came another disaster, an avalanche. On October 29th, a massive avalanche struck the wreckage during the night. Snow poured into the fuselage. People sleeping inside were buried. The airplane became a tomb. 8 more people died, and the survivors had to dig themselves out. Imagine already being trapped in the mountains for more than 2 weeks, already starving, already freezing. And then the shelter you depend on is suddenly buried under tons of snow. At this point, I honestly think most people would mentally break. But somehow they kept going. They dug. They pulled people out. They counted the survivors. And they realized once again there were fewer of them. By December, only 16 people remained alive. Think about that number. 45 people had boarded the airplane. 16 were still alive. And those 16 were sitting in the middle of the Andes. They had survived almost 2 months. They had survived freezing nights, starvation, injuries, an avalanche, and the psychological torture of watching people around them die. And still, there was no rescue. That's when someone had to make a decision: stay here or leave. That person was Nando Parrado. And this is where, for me, the story changes completely. Because Parrado had his own reasons to leave. His mother had died in the crash. His sister Susana had survived initially, but was badly injured. She eventually died too. And Parrado had spent weeks living with that loss. But he also had something the others desperately needed: determination. He believed they had to get out, not wait, not hope, not pray for an airplane. Go, find help. And I have to admit, I don't know if I would have had the courage to make that decision, because leaving the fuselage meant leaving the only shelter they had. It meant walking into mountains they knew almost nothing about, and if they were wrong about the direction, they could simply disappear. Parrado eventually convinced Roberto Canessa to go with him. A third man, Antonio Vicintin, joined them. They prepared as best they could. There was no proper climbing gear, no modern navigation system, no comfortable backpack, no rescue radio. They had extremely limited food, and they were already severely weakened. Then, on December 12th, they left the crash site. I want you to picture this. Behind them is the wreckage. Inside that wreckage are 14 people waiting for them. Ahead, nothing. Just mountains. Parrado and Canessa begin climbing, and for a while they believe they can do it. But the mountain keeps getting steeper. The snow gets deeper. Their bodies are exhausted. And eventually they realize that the journey isn't going to be the short walk they imagined. It's going to take days, maybe many days, and they don't have enough food for that. The third member of the expedition, Vicintin, eventually turned back. There wasn't enough food for 3 people, so he gave his supplies to Parrado and Canessa. Think about how difficult that decision must have been. He was voluntarily returning to the crash site, not because he had given up, but because 2 men had a better chance of reaching help if they carried his food. And now there were only 2, Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa. 2 young men walking into the Andes for everyone else. The next days were brutal. They climbed, they descended, they crossed snow, they moved across dangerous terrain. They slept wherever they could. Their bodies became weaker. And the higher they climbed, the more they realized something terrifying. The Andes were much bigger than they had imagined. They had hoped that when they reached the top of one mountain, they would see the green valleys of Chile. Instead, they saw more mountains, and more mountains, and more mountains. Can you imagine that? You climb for hours, you're exhausted, you're starving. You're thinking, once I reach the top, I'll see civilization. You finally reach the top, and there is nothing, only another mountain. That, to me, must have been one of the most psychologically devastating moments of the entire journey. Because the mountain wasn't just physically large, it was destroying their sense of hope. But they kept moving, day after day. Their food was disappearing. Their bodies were losing weight. Canessa was becoming increasingly weak. Parrado later recalled how physically exhausted they had become. But they had a reason to continue. There were 14 people behind them. 14 people who were waiting. 14 people who were depending on them. And I think that matters. Because when you're fighting only for yourself, there comes a point where you can say, I can't do this anymore. But when other people are waiting for you, quitting becomes much harder. Eventually, something changed. The snow began to thin. The landscape started looking different. They saw signs that they were descending toward a lower elevation. And then they saw vegetation. Real vegetation, not just snow, not just rock. Green. That must have looked like another planet. After weeks of white and grey, green probably looked almost unbelievable. Then they found signs of animals, and eventually cattle, cows. This was huge, because cows meant something. People, farmers, civilization. They weren't just wandering through an endless mountain anymore. There had to be someone nearby. Then came the moment that changed everything. Parrado and Canessa reached a river, and on the other side, they saw a man on horseback, a Chilean muleteer named Sergio Catalan. At first, they couldn't communicate. The river was too loud. The distance was too great. They shouted. He couldn't understand them. They shouted again. Nothing. And I can only imagine the frustration. You've been walking for 10 days. You've nearly died. You finally see another human being, and you can't even talk to him. But Catalan understood that something was wrong. So he threw a stone wrapped with paper across the river. Parrado picked it up and wrote a message. The message essentially said, "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains." They explained that they were Uruguayan, that they had been walking for 10 days, that 14 people remained at the wreckage, that they were hungry, weak, and desperate for help. Then they threw the message back, and Catalan understood. He had found survivors from the missing airplane, people who everyone else believed were dead. And then came one of the most beautiful little moments in this entire story. Catalan told them, "Tomorrow. Tomorrow. That's it." After 72 days of horror, those men finally had something they hadn't had in a very long time. A reason to believe tomorrow might actually exist. Catalan went for help. Parrado and Canessa were taken to safety, and authorities finally understood where the survivors were. Now the helicopters could come. On December 22nd, the rescue operation began. Helicopters flew into the Andes, and for the people still at the wreckage, there was finally something unbelievable happening. They heard engines. At first, they probably weren't sure. Then they looked up and saw helicopters. After more than 2 months, someone had finally come for them. The survivors were rescued over December 22nd and 23rd. 16 people had survived. 45 had boarded the aeroplane. 29 had died. And I think that's where most versions of this story end. The helicopters arrive, people cry, they go home, everyone celebrates. But personally, that's not the part of the story that stays with me. What stays with me is everything that happened before the helicopters. The waiting, the hunger, the cold, the moral decisions, the avalanche, the decision to leave. And especially that moment when Parrado and Canessa reached the top of a mountain and saw more mountains. Because I think that's life in its most extreme form. You think you're almost there, then you realize you're not. And you have to decide whether you're going to keep going anyway. There is another thing I find fascinating about this story. These people weren't professional survivalists. They weren't elite mountaineers. They didn't have decades of experience in the Andes. They were rugby players, students, friends, and family members. They were completely unprepared for what happened. And yet they adapted. They turned an airplane into shelter. They used whatever materials they could find. They treated injuries. They organized food. They protected each other from the cold. They made decisions that were almost impossible to make. And eventually, 2 of them walked out. Nando Parrado later became a successful businessman, author, and speaker. Roberto Canessa became a doctor. And when I think about that, there's something almost surreal about it. Imagine meeting one of them decades later. You see an older man. You see a successful professional. And somewhere inside that person is the memory of being 19 or 23 years old, standing in the middle of the Andes, starving, surrounded by mountains, wondering whether tomorrow would ever come. That's the part history sometimes hides. The person doesn't stay frozen in the year of the disaster. They go on living, they build families, they work, they grow old, but they carry those mountains with them. I've always been fascinated by history because of moments like this. Not because I enjoy tragedy, quite the opposite. I think stories like this remind us how fragile ordinary life actually is. We spend most of our time worrying about things that feel enormous to us: work, money, cars, messages, arguments, plans. And then you hear a story like this, and suddenly the priorities become very simple. Warmth, water, food, another person beside you, a reason to wake up tomorrow. That's it. And if there's one thing I take from the Andes survivors, it's this. Hope isn't always a feeling. Sometimes hope is a decision. Parado didn't know there was a valley on the other side. He didn't know he'd meet Sergio Catalan. He didn't know helicopters would arrive. He didn't know whether he and Canessa would survive the journey. He simply decided that staying there meant certain death. So he walked. And then he walked again, and again, and again, for 10 days. That's why I wouldn't describe this simply as a story about a plane crash. The crash lasted minutes. The survival lasted 72 days. The rescue expedition lasted about 10 days. But the real story is what happened inside the minds of those people during all that time. How do you continue when the outside world believes you're dead? How do you eat when the only food available forces you to confront your own morality? How do you sleep when an avalanche can bury you? How do you keep moving when the mountain in front of you seems endless? And most importantly, how do you convince yourself that there is still a tomorrow? The Andes didn't give these people a miracle. Not really. The mountain didn't suddenly become friendly. The snow didn't disappear. The dead didn't come back. The food didn't magically appear. The rescue planes didn't find them. The survivors had to adapt to reality. And eventually, they had to create their own chance. That's what makes this story so powerful to me. Because survival wasn't one heroic moment. It was hundreds of tiny decisions. Stay warm, help someone, save food, treat a wound, don't waste energy, keep moving, don't give up, do it again tomorrow. And maybe that's why, more than 50 years later, the story still feels almost impossible. Because when you look at the Andes, you can still see how enormous that place is. You can still imagine that white landscape, the mountains, the glaciers, the silence, and somewhere in that landscape, there was a broken airplane. Inside it were 16 people who refused to disappear. 2 of them eventually walked away from the wreckage. They crossed mountains that should have been impossible to cross. They found a river. They found a man on horseback, and they delivered one of the most important messages in survival history. We are alive. On December 22nd and 23rd, 1972, the remaining survivors were finally brought out of the Andes. 72 days after the crash, 16 people came home. Their story became known around the world and later inspired books, documentaries and films, including Alive and Society of the Snow. But whenever I hear this story, I don't think about the movies. I think about that first night, the cold, the broken airplane, the people looking up at the mountains, and someone probably asking the question that everyone was thinking. How are we ever going to get out of here? They didn't know. And maybe that's the most important part. They didn't need to know how they were going to survive 72 days. They just had to survive the next day, then the next, then the next. Until eventually, there was a horseman on the other side of a river, and after 10 days of walking, there was finally someone who could hear them. They boarded an airplane, expecting to play rugby in Chile. They crashed into the Andes. The world thought they were dead, and 72 days later, 16 of them came home. That's not just a story about surviving a plane crash. It's a story about what happens when hope is almost gone, and someone decides to keep walking anyway.